I never thought loneliness could feel this heavy. It crept in slowly, filling every quiet moment of my life, pressing against me in the spaces my husband used to occupy. I had done everything right, or at least I thought I had. A devoted wife, a caring mother, a woman who had spent decades making sure everyone else was taken care of. And yet, here I was, invisible in my own home. My husband and I barely spoke anymore. His presence was nothing more than a shadow moving through the house. Work kept him late, exhaustion kept him silent, and routine kept us strangers. I could sit next to him for hours, yet it felt like I was miles away. I told myself it was normal, that marriage after so many years simply settled into this quiet distance. But deep down, I ached for something more. My daughter, bless her, was happily married and visited often. She and her husband, David, made a beautiful couple. She was vibrant, full of life, and he adored her. Watching them together reminded me of what I had lost, of a time when my husband used to look at me the way David looked at her. David had always been kind, always polite. But one evening, something shifted. My daughter had stepped out for a quick errand, leaving him behind to help with dinner. It wasn't anything dramatic, just simple, casual conversation as he dried dishes while I washed. But then he looked at me, really looked at me, and asked, "Are you okay?" No one had asked me that in years. The words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I couldn't answer. I smiled, brushing it off. Of course, just tired. But he didn't just nod and move on like everyone else did. He watched me, as if he could see through the layers of politeness I had wrapped around myself. "You just seem, I don't know, different lately." I shrugged, trying to shake off the strange warmth his concern brought me. "That's life, I suppose." He didn't push, just gave me a small smile. But something in me stirred, a feeling I had long buried, something that felt dangerously close to being seen. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, his back turned to me as always, my mind drifted back to that moment. It wasn't anything inappropriate, wasn't even a real conversation. And yet, I felt something I hadn't in a long time acknowledged. Days passed, but the thought lingered. Every time David visited, I became hyper-aware of his presence. His voice, his laugh, the way he carried himself. It was ridiculous, I told myself. He was my daughter's husband, a man who was simply kind. But kindness was a dangerous thing when you had been starved of it for so long. One evening, my daughter and David were over for dinner again. My daughter had stepped outside to take a call, leaving the two of us alone at the table. He poured me a glass of wine, his fingers brushing against mine as he handed it over. A harmless touch, so brief it could have meant nothing. And yet, my skin burned where he had touched me. I could feel his eyes on me, lingering just a second longer than necessary. My heart pounded against my ribcage, an unfamiliar thrill running through me. I forced a smile, forcing my hands to remain steady as I took a sip. "You should do things for yourself more," he said suddenly. "Go out, have fun. You deserve it." I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "It's not that easy." "Why not?" He tilted his head slightly, genuinely curious. I could have given him a dozen reasons: my responsibilities, my marriage, the fact that women like me didn't just chase happiness. But instead, I just looked away, focusing on the glass in my hands. Because the real answer was much simpler. I had forgotten how. The rest of the evening passed in a blur, but his words stayed with me. That night, as I got ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in years, I saw myself not as a wife, not as a mother, but as a woman. A woman who had once been desired, who had once been loved, who had once been seen. And it terrified me. I told myself it was nothing. Just the product of a lonely mind grasping onto the first bit of attention it received. But the way my pulse quickened when I thought of David, the way my skin tingled at the memory of that brief touch, I knew better. I was playing with fire. I just wasn't sure if I wanted to put it out. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting moment. A harmless interaction. But the problem with loneliness is that it makes even the smallest gestures feel monumental. And once you've felt something after being numb for so long, It's impossible to ignore. I started noticing things about David that I hadn't before. The way he truly listened when I spoke. The way his compliments felt different from the polite ones my husband used to give me out of obligation. The way his eyes lingered, just a second too long, before he looked away. I wasn't foolish. I knew the boundaries that existed between us. I knew my place, and I knew his. But the lines that once felt so clear were beginning to blur. It started with small things. He would find excuses to help me in the kitchen, standing closer than necessary. When my daughter talked, he would glance at me during a joke, as if waiting for my reaction before anyone else's. And every time he touched me, an innocent graze, a guiding hand on my back, it sent a shiver through me that I tried desperately to ignore. I began to anticipate his visits more than I should have. I told myself it was because I enjoyed his company, nothing more. But then I caught myself doing things I hadn't done in years. A touch of lipstick before dinner. A little more effort with my hair. Wearing a dress instead of my usual comfortable clothes. Small changes, ones no one else seemed to notice. Except for him. One evening, as I set plates on the table, David leaned against the counter, watching me. "You look beautiful tonight." I laughed, shaking my head. "Don't be silly." "I'm not," he said simply. "I just think you should hear it more often." The air between us shifted. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to look away, pretending his words didn't affect me. Pretending I didn't feel my body betray me, with warmth spreading through my skin. It should have ended there. I should have walked away, changed the subject, done anything to pull myself back from whatever dangerous edge I was approaching. But I didn't. Days passed, and the pull between us grew stronger. It was in the stolen glances, the charged silences, the unspoken understanding that something was happening, something neither of us had the courage to name. One night, my daughter had to leave early, but David stayed behind, saying he would help me clean up. I told him he didn't have to, but he insisted. The house felt quieter than usual, the space between us smaller. As I wiped the table, he stood next to me, closer than necessary. His voice was softer than usual when he spoke. "You shouldn't have to feel so alone." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I could hear my heartbeat, loud and insistent. I turned to face him, forcing a smile. "I don't know what you mean." He didn't look away. "Yes, you do." 1,000 thoughts ran through my mind at once. The logical ones screamed at me to end this now, to create distance, to remind myself who we were to each other. But another part of me, the part that had been starved of affection, of attention, of feeling wanted, kept me frozen in place. I saw it in his eyes. The hesitation, the internal battle, the same war I was fighting within myself. I took a step back, nodded, his jaw tightening. "I'll see you." I had convinced myself that I could stop it, that I could ignore the way my body reacted whenever he was near, that I could push down the feelings that had started to consume me. But desire has a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how tightly you try to seal them. The distance I had tried to create didn't last. If anything, it only made the tension worse. Every time we were in the same room, it felt like an unspoken challenge. Who would break first? And then, one night I did. My daughter had gone out of town for a few days, and David had stopped by unexpectedly. He said he was just checking in, making sure I wasn't alone. It was a reasonable excuse, one I didn't question too much, at least not out loud. I invited him in, telling myself it was harmless. We sat in the living room, talking over a glass of wine. It started as casual conversation, the kind we had shared many times before. But there was something different about the way he looked at me that night. Something heavier. "You always put everyone else first," he said, swirling the wine in his glass. "Don't you ever get tired of it?" I smiled, trying to brush it off. "That's just life." "But it doesn't have to be," he said, his voice quieter now. "You deserve more than this." I didn't respond. I couldn't, because if I did, I would have to admit that I agreed with him, that I had spent so many years giving and giving, with nothing left for myself. The silence stretched between us, thick with things left unsaid. And then he reached out. A slow, tentative movement, his fingers brushing against my hand. It was such a simple touch, but it sent a current through me so strong that I couldn't breathe. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it went any further. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers curl around his, my grip tightening ever so slightly. His eyes searched mine, waiting for permission, for rejection, for anything. I didn't give him either. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. But suddenly, his lips were on mine, and the world around us ceased to exist. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't frantic. It was slow, deep, the kind of kiss that made me forget who I was, what I was doing, what this would mean. For the first time in years, I felt wanted, needed, alive. But reality has a way of creeping back in, no matter how much you try to drown it out. I pulled away first, my breathing uneven, my heart pounding. This is wrong. His hand was still on my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. I know. We sat there, staring at each other, the weight of what we had done pressing down on us. He leaned back, running a hand through his hair. I should go. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As he walked to the door, he hesitated. I don't regret it, he admitted, but I don't want to hurt you. I forced a smile, even as my chest ached. Then we should stop this now. But as he left, I knew deep down that it wasn't over. Not yet. I told myself that night was the end of it, that I would wake up the next morning and pretend nothing had happened, that I could bury it like a secret never spoken. But some things refused to stay hidden. David and I avoided each other after that. When my daughter visited, he was polite but distant. There were no more lingering glances, no more stolen touches. He was trying to do the right thing. So was I. But the distance only made it worse. The tension simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but ever-present. Every moment we were near each other felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting to fall. And I was already too close to the edge. One evening, my daughter had planned a small dinner at her house and insisted I come. I hesitated at first, knowing what it would mean to be in that space with him again. But saying no would have raised questions, so I went. David was quiet that night, barely looking at me. But I could feel it, the weight of everything unsaid pressing between us. At some point, she stepped out to take a phone call, leaving us alone in the kitchen. The air shifted instantly, heavy with something I couldn't name but knew too well. I turned to leave, but before I could, he reached for me, his fingers curling around my wrist. It was a light touch, but it sent a tremor through my body. I miss you, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. Don't. I can't stop thinking about you. His grip tightened just slightly, enough to make me stay. Tell me you don't feel the same, and I'll let go. But I couldn't, because we both knew the truth. Before I could stop myself, I turned back toward him. It was reckless, dangerous, but in that moment I didn't care. His lips met mine again, desperate this time, a collision of everything we had been holding back. And then a sharp intake of breath. I pulled away instantly, heart pounding as I turned to see my daughter standing in the doorway. Her eyes flicked between us, confusion morphing into something worse. Realization. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. The silence was enough to split me in two. David stepped back, guilt written all over his face. It's not what you think. But it was exactly what she thought. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head in disbelief. My own mother. The words hit harder than any slap could have. I tried to speak, to explain, to find some way to make it right, but there was nothing I could say that would erase what had just happened. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I trusted you. The weight of her disappointment crushed me. I had broken something that could never be repaired. David tried to reach for her, but she stepped back, looking at both of us, as if we were strangers. Then, without another word, she walked out. And just like that, everything was ruined. The days that followed were a blur. My daughter refused to speak to me. My husband noticed something was off, but I didn't have the strength to pretend anymore. The guilt was suffocating, a constant presence that wouldn't let me breathe. David tried to reach out once, but I ignored him. There was nothing left to say. I packed a bag a week later and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just needed to disappear. Sitting in a small apartment miles away from the life I destroyed, I wondered if it had been real. If it had been love or just loneliness disguised as something more. I would never know. But one thing was certain. I was lonely and my son-in-law noticed. And noticing was the worst thing he could have done.